The democratization process in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, 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 Singhale, Heladiv as it was known previously. Now that democratization process began in the period of British rule in the 20th century. It would, however, be unwise to start with the early 20th century. One has to look at the pre-history of the island of Ceylon before that. Ceylon, Ceylon, Singhale had forms of autocratic kingship well before the European colonial powers came to Asia and set up their colonies. As you know, there are many pre-colonial forms of government. There are some areas where they are just tribal peoples, but other regions have had reasonably well developed states and ruling classes with considerable intellectual capacity. Sri Lanka, or Singhale as it was known way back, was fortunate in being able to develop a civilization from about the 2nd century BC. These people were under a king, and under the autocratic rule of kings, they developed irrigation technology in the northern plains and east and southeastern plains of Sri Lanka from the 2nd century BC, and this civilization, the Sinhala civilization, also known as Singhale and various such names, lasted till the 12th, 13th century. But for reasons that are not entirely clear, but including perhaps salination, salt development in the reservoirs, and because of political decline, the people of the Sinhala people moved to the southwest and central areas of Sri Lanka from the 13th century onwards, and the irrigation civilization declined. The peoples, other than the Aboriginal peoples left in some of the remnant jungles, the people were under an autocratic rule with power emanating from the top and flowing downwards. There was a class order organized by caste, so it was a layered society, but with a king at the apex. Now that was the situation when the Portuguese arrived in the early 16th century, and that was the situation in the southwest, while in the north there was a sub-kingdom or a kingdom ruled by Tamil kings or sub-kings in the north. In the east too there were Tamils, but they were considered to be part of the Sinhala kingdom of Sitawaka, and then subsequently part of the Sinhala kingdom of Kandy, and in fact the Tamil chieftains on the eastern coast paid homage to the king of Kandy in the 16th and 17th century. However, these kings were now faced with the threat coming from the Portuguese and the Dutch, and they lost some territories on the coast to the Portuguese and then to the Dutch. But they fought. There were battles between the Sitawaka kingdom and the Portuguese, and then subsequently between the Kandian peoples under their king and the Portuguese. And then the Dutch came in the mid 17th century, displaced the Portuguese. They too had battles initially with the king of Kandy, but worked out a via media and ruled the coast in the southwest and the east for roughly 150 years. But while ruling the coast, the Dutch were quite happy to pay homage to the king of Kandy, and they sent embassies to the Kandy, spoke of themselves as His Majesty's vassals in Colombo, and so there was a certain nominal acceptance of the overarching sovereignty of the King of Kandy. And I think this sovereignty was marked, signaled, symbolized by the symbol of a parasol. But it was most evident in annual embassies where the Dutch ambassador went and knelt before the king. So what you see in the 17th and 18th century are forms of autocratic rule where the king was His Majesty. I don't think there were female kings, so there was no Her Majesty. There was His Majesty, and there was, bowing and scraping and sort of almost obeisance, where people accepted his power and greatness and, in a sense, holiness. And this is seen in some of the pictures and drawings that are presented those days, and when the Dutch ambassador knelt before the king. So you had forms of superordination and subordination, and sometimes the subordination was quite abject and servile. So what did this mean? This meant that power flowed from the top down, and people at the bottom expected decisions from above, sometimes from the majesty above, not from anybody else. Alongside this system of superordination and subordination, you also had considerable influence, informal influence, wielded by the Buddhist monks of the major monasteries, the Malvat chapter and the Asgiriya chapter, centered now in the 18th century in Kandy. And here too, who is the overarching, shall I say, pontifical authority? None other than Buddha, represented by his statues. So if you go into temples, or if you go look at temple processions, if you look at the temple paintings, if you look at the temple statuary and sculptures, what do you get? People within the umbrella and power of the Buddha and the Dhamma, so that you have a concept known as Pirivaragana, and this is seen also in processions where people are following the leader and expecting benefits from the leader and decisions to come from top to bottom. But the point here is that the people below are not taking decisions, they expect direction from above. Now, this feudal order, if you want to call it, but pre-colonial, pre-capitalist, medieval order of power and authority that existed from way back but was now having an 18th century form, had to face the intervention of the British, who, because of European conflicts, came and sought to get hold of the Dutch colonies in Asia, and they displaced the Dutch in 1795-96 in the Low Country, and then it attempted to conquer Kandy. They failed in 1803, but in 1815 used internal troubles within the Kingdom of Kandy to conquer Kandy using military power, assisted by the naval power, which was able to send troops from the east as well as from the south and the west, and they conquered Kandy in 1815, got hold of the king and deported him. So they were now ruling Kandy, but they immediately 1817-18 faced a rebellion, which they put down very fiercely and with lots of massacres and kills and scorched earth policy. But the rebellion failed and the British consolidated their rule. So from 1815-18 Ceylon was under British rule. Well, Britain, early 19th century, it was benefiting from the Industrial Revolution, the development of railways, better technology, telecommunications, telegraph, better armaments and better military capacity, but still restricted. But of course, also in an island like Ceylon, benefiting from British naval power and their ability to move troops from anywhere to any part of the island. So, from 1815, 1818, you then had one form of autocratic colonial rule, where the head of state was a governor. And this governor also had all the trappings of imperial power, and so decisions flowed from top to bottom. This power was now, as I said, supported or strengthened and consolidated by the ability to build roads and railways. And a process began of connecting the highland terrain, the mountainous terrain of Sri Lanka to the capital, to the ports, through road building, through bridge building. So part of the industrial capacity was the ability to build bridges and not depend on ferries. So eventually a railway and road network was built, especially to the center of the island, because the British not only technological advance, of course, there was a process of capital accumulation through companies, through individuals, and in Sri Lanka this meant initially the expansion of coffee cultivation. Later coffee was replaced by tea and also supplemented by rubber, and quite early on, from the 1840s, coconut plantations were also developed. So you got capitalism through the development of coconut plantations and coffee plantations, as well as some cinnamon and citronella and other plantations in the low country. So that was then the set of processes that the people of Sri Lanka were subject to, and from which some of them benefited, because it was not purely a British enterprise. They needed ancillary services which are provided by the local people. Now, what were these ancillary services? They needed middle-level administrators. For this purpose, they started education in English, because they made English the language of administration. So you had then, from within the different local peoples, you had the emergence of a middle class, lower middle class and upper middle class. Some educated people or wealthier people who were gaining benefits from British rule, but under a autocratic dispensation. And how did the middle class emerge? Partly through education, a school system which the British developed, especially in the towns and in certain areas. Among those whom they deployed in these services were the burghers, who were mixed blood descendants, some of them Dutch, some of them Portuguese descendants, who were living in the coastal areas and who picked up the new language of English and began to work under the British. The Tamils in the north were benefited from missionary schools set up which were set up very early on, and they too developed a lower middle class who were working for the British, not only in the north, but many of them came to the south and came to Colombo. So there is then a certain movement of the population and the development of a middle class cum capitalist class. Some of them with educational skills, but some of them becoming wealthy through trade, through manufacture. Manufacture like furniture, for instance, was something that the Sri Lanka was doing. The coffee was transported in barrels. So those who made barrels became wealthy. Some enterprise in Sri Lankans, many of them from the Karawa and Salagama and Durava castes, became very, very wealthy. Also, some of them became Christians. And so they were able to develop plantations and use their wealth to consolidate their position. So that process was taking place in the 19th century. So it was a form of modernization involving capitalism, involving new administrative systems, and many Sri Lankans or Ceylonese, as we would call them then, some Ceylonese benefit from this process and participated in the process. However, it was still top down. It was a governor ruling. However, this governor decided, well, the British decided that they needed advice. They set up a small legislative council of officials, but with 3 nominated locals. Well-to-do people, educated locals were also nominated, but this was just an advisory council. But here is the beginning of, well, I suppose delegation of authority, a beginning of people, colonial peoples gaining some influence through the Legislative Council. And not only the Legislative Council, in 4 towns, Kandy, Colombo, Galle and Jaffna, they set up municipal councils later on. So here too, then they had locals entering the municipal councils and gaining experience in debate, in presenting arguments, in learning, well, how to politely question and challenge those above them. So that was taking place. At the same time, there was a question of colonial dominance that was girded and threaded by racism. The British, most of them anyway, were racist. They believed that the whites were superior. I've seen diaries written by the women, British women who looked down on the natives and didn't like color. There was a racial prejudice against dark skin, against blacks. And they looked down on them, and you could see it in their faces, you could see it in their expressions. Now, when you face that sort of domination, some people anyway developed a sense of resistance. They did not like it. So there was the reaction against white racism coming from some Ceylonese and Sri Lankans. That is one aspect. But even more important, apart from racism and white prejudice, you had Christian missionary prejudices. The evangelical zealots of that era came, and they thought that, Buddhism, Hinduism, all this, they are worshipping idols, they looked down on the religions, they talked of idolatry, idolatry, and they denounced it, attacked it. So you had then the drive to to rescue these idiot religious worshippers and make them into Christians, whether it was into the American Protestant or Catholic or Methodist or Anglican. It don't matter. There was this missionary endeavor to convert people. Now, that generated strong resistance from educated Tamil Hindu spokesmen like Arumuga Navala, from educated Sinhala Buddhist priests and some Sinhala educated literati. So you had challenges to, these people began to challenge the white superior missionaries. And this began in Jaffna from the 1840s. Also began in that period, same period in the southwest, but especially in the 1860s and 70s. And there was a famous debate in 1873 in Panadura where Sinhalese Christian priests were challenged by a number of Buddhist monks led by mostly Gunananda, and so then you're having a battle for religious minds between the so-called superior Christian forces and the colonized, dominated Sinhala Buddhist forces in the population. And this developed then in the late 19th century, continued resistance, and that resistance moved on and was taken up by lay Sinhalese spokespersons, usually males, writing novels, developing Sinhala newspapers, and challenging the British and challenging the Christians, challenging and resisting westernization. They began to emphasize local practices in how you dress, and so this was a political challenge taking place through cultural modalities, through cultural roots, from the late 19th century on into the 20th century. And one branch of this cultural resistance was the Temperance Movement, because some Buddhists said alcohol has been introduced by the British, and this drunkenness is a feature of British society, especially at the upper levels of society, and they began criticizing the westernized practices of some Ceylonese as well as the British. So what you get is, well, I suppose you can present it as Sinhalese nationalism or Ceylonese nationalism, challenging some of the practices and lifestyles of the ruling classes, including some Sri Lankan westernized ruling classes who had adopted westernized lifestyle. So that was going on from the late 19th century and flowed on into the 20th century and continued, and in fact linked up, I would say, eventually with what's called the 1956 revolution under the Bandaranayakas and the SLFP. But that's one broad strand of political resistance, one broad strand of democratization with its own problems, generating other problems. But that strand is there. But at the same time, especially among the English educated Ceylonese, whether Tamil, Sinhalese, Burgher, Malay, Muslim, there were some who began to, because of their education, because they looked at European history, they were influenced by the intellectual currents of Europe. What were the intellectual currents? Notions of parliamentary democracy, what's called liberalism or liberal democracy, they are similar terms, and also ideas of nationalism associated with various authors like Herder, Rousseau, others, the ideas that went into the French Revolution, the ideas that led to parliamentary reform in Britain. Don't forget, women could not vote in Britain till the 20th century, but even the vote there took some time. It was 1832, 1867, so there was parliamentary reform. And the Sri Lankans of the early 20th century learnt about this. They picked up this, the political thinking of Europe was adopted by some Sri Lankan intellectuals, and they began to then challenge the British in European coinage. They began to challenge the British in European language in terms of representation, democracy, suffrage, all that. This was mostly in the early 20th century, though there are some strands which can be traced further back. For example, around 1906, the Ceylon Social Reform society was set up with Ananda Kumaraswamy fairly active in it, and they began asking for certain changes and improvements. There was the Ceylon National Association, which was a political association, asking for more representation. That was in the first decade of the 20th century. And then in 1917, a small group in Colombo, a small group of educated Ceylonese set up the Ceylon Reform League, and the president was Ponnambalam Arunachalam from Jaffna, but living in Colombo. That Reform League became the Ceylon National Congress in 1919, and from 1919 to 1940s, and actually up to 1951, the Ceylon National Congress was one of the leading driving associations asking for greater representation, for greater power to be handed to the local Ceylonese. So they were the leaders of the nationalist struggle, but asking for liberal reforms. The British, 1919-1920, tried to accommodate them by giving something, expanding the Legislative Council. That was beginning to prove unworkable. And then the British government, in its wisdom, in late 1927, decided to send the Dynamo Commission out to Sri Lanka to kind of rework the political order in Sri Lanka. Now, this British government was a Labour government. So here then you had changes in Britain where there's a Labour Party, there was a more liberal regime in Britain with Sidney Webb and others having influence, and they sent a commission headed by Lord Dynamo, but having in Sir Drummond Shields and Francis Butler, two of the three commissioners, people of, shall I say, reformist, progressive attitudes. So the Dynamo Commission came in 1927, 1928, and they, believe it or not, suggested that there should be a new state council system where, shall we say, there were 3 key posts held by British officials, but 7 to be Sri Lankans. So it was, in a sense, a system where there was 7/10 independence roughly, but with the governor still on top. But not only 7/10 independent, more radical, they wanted nearly universal suffrage. They wanted people, men over 21 to get the vote and women over 31. The Legislative Council said, well, you might as well give the vote to all men and women over 21. So what happened? 1931, Ceylon got, well, 7/10 independence with universal suffrage. It was a very radical move, and it's an important step in the progress towards decolonization, the progress of democratization, because here is the vote, universal suffrage. Here there are some unstudied areas. It is my speculation that these radical suggestions, coming from a progressive element in the British political dispensation of that time, it is my speculation that because Sri Lanka was an island, Ceylon was an island, and because of British naval power, they were able to experiment and give a lot to Sri Lanka, because if they wanted, they could take it back. You mustn't forget British naval power existing up to 1941 when the Japanese gave them a bit of a shock. So this naval power was a background factor which we have to take into account. But whatever it is, the Dynamo reforms set up a state council which created a board of ministers, 3 British officials in key positions, governor there, but 7 ministers to be Sri Lankan. and they set it up. So this was a considerable handing over of power, more power than the Indian National Congress and the Indians had at that time, though in 1935 India also got a substantial dose of power and authority. But Sri Lanka got there before, and I think they got it because of the progressive thinking, the liberal and progressive thinking of the Dynamo Commission and the government that was there in Britain, but also because of British naval capacities. But this changed the system. While the Ceylon National Congress continued, and while they continued to agitate, and while they were soon joined and even outflanked by the leftist elements, both a Communist Party and the Trotskyist parties who came up in the 1930s, and you had a dual challenge now to the British, well, threefold challenge. There were the Tamils who were worried about the Sinhalese majority, who also wanted independence but had concerns, and the Tamils themselves were divided. But then there was the mainstream conservative Sri Lankans who dominated the state council, and then there are the leftist forces who were more radical, more demanding, more virulent, and more anti-Western, and more, well, also very capable guys. Philip Gunawardena, Colvin R. De Silva, N.M. Pereira, they were there in the 1930s, beginning to challenge the British. And the state council was really, in a sense, the chief engineer, because they had considerable authority. They were able to dispense welfare and resources. So the Ceylon National Congress was kind of sidelined. It was there, it continued to agitate, but it was basically sidelined, and it was the board of ministers that was calling the shots. At this point, in fact, the board of ministers and the Sri Lankan demands reached such a level that in 1938, the governor of his time, Sir Andrew Caldecott, a very capable man, he decided that this won't do, and he gave into some demands and proposed changes which gave Sri Lanka even more power than before. These are the Caldecott reform proposals of 1938, a much neglected arena. Neglected because nothing happened. And why did nothing happen? Because these were in 38, 39, because the Second World War broke out in 1939. So the Second World War actually slowed down whatever progress was feasible under the Caldecott suggestions, and that was, they passed, the world situation moved beyond that. But what did the Second World War also do for Sri Lanka? It made Sri Lanka more important because, India, there was the Japanese threat in Burma and Thailand, and there was a threat to India that way. But the Japanese threat was mainly in the Pacific and in the South China Bay, and then Singapore fell in 1941 when the Japanese conquered Malaysia and Singapore. So Ceylon became very, very important in the British and Western war effort. And the bases, especially the naval bases, Trincomalee and Colombo, and the airfields in Katunayaka, Koggala, Trinco became very, very important. And Ceylon then was also where Lord Mountbatten, who was in overall charge of British war strategy, he set up headquarters in Peradeniya, in Ceylon. And that is Mountbatten. But what did they do for the political system? They set Admiral Leighton to be the chief alongside the governor. So the governor became kind of sidelined with Leighton seated next to him. It was Leighton who was calling the shots. And in this situation, well, the communists and others were actually put into jail. Ceylon National Congress was still making demands, but they were actually a sideshow. Who was important within the Ceylonese ruling class? It was the new president of the Board of Ministers, one D.S. Sedanayaka, a very astute politician, a landowner, he was a capitalist, but an astute politician. He was important. But not only him. So was Oliver Gunathilaka, later knighted, OEG, because OEG's office, by the way, was he was made Civil Defense Commissioner and Deputy to Leighton. So he is Admiral in charge of the war effort. Under him is O.E. Gunathilaka, but O.E. Gunathilaka is buddies with D.S. Sedanayaka, and their officers are next to each other. So here, after this, from about 1940-41, the leading challenge, the maneuver in the political shaping of the Sri Lankan movement to independence was led by D.S. Sedanayaka and O.E. Gunathilaka, working in tandem but with advisory people. And who was advising O.E. Gunathilaka and D.S.? None other than Ivor Jennings, because Ivor Jennings had been made head of the University College, and he was a University Chancellor. But he was also Deputy Civil Defense Commissioner working under OEG. So this team of OEG, D.S. Sedanayaka and Ivor Jennings were the ones who schemed and planned the way for Sri Lanka to get independence in the years 1941 to 48. And it was a slow progress because, 1945, war was over, Japan had surrendered. The Board of Ministers and DS immediately put up certain demands from Britain, asking for a commission, asking for independence. And they went to Britain to argue this. And what did Britain tell D.S. Sedanayaka? We can't sort this out just yet. India is a major problem. We have to sort that out first, then we'll deal with you. So in a way, what was happening in India delayed Sri Lanka's progress by a couple of years or something. Because the DS said, how did India help you during the war? We helped you. Why don't you answer, give us our due? The British had no answer for that. They had no answer for that. But they said, no, India is more important. And obviously it's more important. It's wealthier. It's more important for Britain. So we had to wait. But eventually, they sent out the Salisbury Commission. I think there was an official boycott of the commission. Yeah, the Board of Ministers refused to meet them. But who was in charge of the arrangements for the Salisbury Commission? None other than OEG, Kattaya, clever, cunning organizer. And he made sure that the opinions of the ministers and D.S. Sedanayaka were conveyed to the Salisbury Commission. He organized their program. And eventually the Salisbury Commission recommended full dominion status, and Sri Lanka got independence in 1948. Well, a bit later than India, independence, but independence that one could say was perhaps flawed in certain ways. But it was total independence because as part of this independence, the D.S. Sedanayaka cabinet had a defense agreement with Britain because Sri Lanka was important for the British interests in the Indian Ocean and the East. So they had a defense agreement. The bases of Kogala, Trinco, Katunayaka continued to operate with British servicemen there. I was born and bred in Gaul. I've been to Kogala. It was, I've seen the British soccer team played our guys in Gaul. So they were still there. And of course the leftists complained that this was still imperial, that we were still servants of the British, and that we were bound to keep these bases. But later, when a new government, a radical government came up in 1956, there was no problem in asking the British to leave, and the British had to leave. So legally, these bases were there on sufferance with the agreement of the Sri Lankan government, because for one thing, the Sri Lankan armed forces did not have the capacity to defend Sri Lanka. So in a sense, DS and others, in pragmatic ways, palmed it off on the British, because they were concentrating on more radical things. And they were not totally idiots. They were not totally conservative. In 1953, they signed a rubber rice deal with China, refused the pressures from the West, and they signed quite a radical step in reaching agreement with China on exchanging rubber for rice. So they were, while conservative and while capitalist, they were not totally totally idiotic. However, I would like to raise questions. Okay, so that's the it was independence, and now universal suffrage from 31, independence from 1948. And those Independence Day ceremonies in 48 and 49 are very interesting to watch on YouTube. But those lessons one has to pursue afterwards. But this is democratization, getting rid of colonial rule, having people elect the government from, elect the chief ministers from 1931, and the fully independent government in 1948, with one qualification. One set of people had limited voting rights, and they were the plantation workers who had come from India from the late 19th century and had been residing there for a long time. These are known as Indian Tamils, most of them plantation workers, not all, they had traders and others. But now their vote, they did not have the vote, or only limited numbers had the vote in 1931, and then even less so in 1948. So this is the non-representative, not wholly democratic aspect of the 1948 situation. Well, the Sri Lankan leaders of 1948 have been criticized for that, criticized especially by the leftists. However, the story is not that simple. I mean, it's a very complex situation. But let me put it this way. PDS Kularatne, who is not a conservative, but I suppose pro-Sinhala, semi-Sinhala radical, he was part of the Bandanayake government. PDS Kularatne once, and he was a headmaster, he said, the problem with these people, the plantation Tamils, is that they have 1 foot in Sri Lanka and 2 feet in India. Now, this is not wholly untrue. They have strong links with India, but it reflects certain Sinhalese prejudices. But also the problem is that they were plantation workers, and many radical thinking Sri Lankans, from the Sinhalese Sri Lankans generally, looked on the plantations with hostility because it was seen as a Western capitalist. So target was the white British rulers and the Pakha Sahibs in the plantations. But in the process, they were also prejudiced against the Indian Tamil plantation laborers. And to understand this, all you have to look at is the writings and presentations of Bernard Oliveira, who was a great follower of Nehru. But when it came to the plantation issue and the Indian Tamils, he was conservative. He didn't want any power given to the plantation workers. So there are all sorts of ironies and anomalies in the democratic process, and that you can look at, you can find out by looking at the positions taken by different politicians. So there was this issue of the plantation labor which continued. And then in 1964, when Mrs. Bandaranaike was the Prime Minister, there was a Sirima Shastri Pact to sort that out, well, one step in the process. And then there was a repatriation of quite a number of the plantation towers went back to India with assistance. But those who remained eventually got the vote, I think in 1983 or so, under right-wing UNP government. So now they have the vote. Not only that, in Nuwara district has a majority of Indian Tamil plantation, Indian Tamil voters. They're not, some of whom are plantation workers, not all are. So they have now a bastion of sorts, politically speaking, and they therefore work in alliance with the Sinhalese parties rather than with the Tamil parties of the north. So that has been a complicated factor and a side stream which you can't neglect when you're looking at democratization, because these are working people who have helped produce the wealth of the country and who have suffered and who were very, very subordinate till, I would say, the last 30, 40 years, when some have got educated and got positions, not all, but they are still among the working class, the majority of them. But one thing they've done, sideline, they have produced a guy called Muttaya Muralidharan, who is a godsend, has been a godsend to cricket, but also a sensible fellow who is not easily manipulated by lords like lords from England, like Cameron, David Cameron and others. He refused to kowtow to them. He has been a relatively sensible voice in the cricketing world. So, yes, democratization, but with universal suffrage. But I think there still are major problems. Well, we saw, okay, 1948 independence under right-wing government, capitalist, challenged by leftists and other elements. And actually it was not the leftists who overturned them, but Sinhala Buddhist forces coming up with a program to reduce the power of the English-educated ruling class of Sri Lanka. And this they did through the vote, led by a English-educated capitalist called Bandaranaike. They displaced the ruling elements who had won independence and seized power in 1956 on a program which in shortened form is known as Sinhala only. So it was an attack on the dominance of the English language and on the dominance of the westernized English-speaking elite, including the burghers. So as a result of what happened in 1946, a political revolution through the vote, a democratic political revolution through the vote, 1956. You had an overturn, and what did this do? For one thing, some of the westernized elements, and especially the burghers, began leaving Sri Lanka. The Tamils, however, felt that they are now a second-class citizens. So this sharpened the rift between Sinhalese and Tamils. So here's democratization, but sharpening the ethnic divide, also leaving anglicized Western people, some of them, to leave Sri Lanka. And then, yes, Sinhalese became the language of government. There were conflicts with the Tamils. But at the same time, English was still de facto a powerful shaper of class advantage. So that some of the Sinhalese educated, the vernacular educated, whether Sinhalese or Tamil, but especially Sinhalese, saw the English language as a sword. So here is democratization sharpening class conflict between the Tamil and Sinhala speaking and the bilingual people. So that became an issue in the 60s and 70s, and there were rebellions and complex story. And let me add to the complexity. and the whole issue of democratization. The vote in 1948, 56, 1960, the voting system was organized according to single member constituencies. You did not have PR or proportional representation. I have a feeling that if we had a system of PR from 1948, some of what happened in the 50s and 60s would not have taken place, because PR could be a fairer system, but we didn't have it. And so I think there were imbalances in representation. But this theory, this is a theory, speculation, I got it from Robert Carney, a political scientist, but it has to be tested out by other scholars. So democratization is not a simple issue. How do you set up a voting system? And all the nitty-gritty of voting has a bearing on democratization. So that's one lesson I'll present to you today. But there are other aspects, and that's what I call the political influence, the political subterranean political influence, political weight of cultural practices, which can be very deeply ingrained in among people. This is a very tentative theory, but democracy means participation in decision making. Okay, you set up people with authority, but authority has to be limited by ability to listen and ability to take decisions in a relatively egalitarian consultative process. But one of the problems in Sri Lanka is the fact that people at the bottom look to the top for decisions. They pay great respect to people with power. They kowtow to power. Not only do they kowtow to power, they want their everyday problems here at the grassroots, the decision to be taken by the guy right at the top, not by anybody in between. So they go straight to the top. It's a top-down flow of authority, which as a form of administration is inefficient. A single person at the top cannot take decisions, take 1 million decisions in the course of a month. He has to be able to delegate. So there's, I think, an inadequate delegation of authority in Sri Lanka. Because democracy requires organized, rational delegation of authority. But if people demand all decisions to be taken by the lokka at the top, by the big man at the top, it is inefficient, and it creates inefficiency, but it creates also obeisance, acceptance of the power of the guy at the top. It actually conduces towards authoritarian rule, kingship, modern forms of democratic kingship. And this is seen in the bearing of big men, prime ministers, presidents, and this, I do not know what the solution is this. How do you educate people to be less dependent, to be more independent? How do you educate people not to go to the Carnegie, Pathini, to Murugan, to all the gods and goddesses and ask for favors? That unless one begins to undermine the power of the gods and goddesses and the power of presidents through machinery of consultation, I think democratization is still incomplete.